Hello and welcome to The Confident Commit, the podcast for anyone who wants to join the conversation about shipping software faster and better.
If you're looking to build a test and ship, tune in, let's confidently commit.
Today I'm joined by Grant Miller from Replicated. We're just realizing we've known each other since 2015. And so today we were just reflecting on the kind of the time that we've been working together and how much software delivery has changed in that time, how much your approach has changed. And would love to just dive into that a little bit. So, for folks who don't know, we use Replicated to deliver our server product. And it's gone through a lot of iterations over the time that we've worked together. So why don't you just start with a quick intro of what Replicated does and how things have changed over the course of the time that you've been doing it?
Yeah, sure. So we started Replicated about 7 years ago. And the whole vision was, basically as containerization, right? That was the real kind of hot idea then, became popular, that it would change enterprise software delivery. Mm-hmm. So specifically, this idea that maybe everything would someday all be SaaS, we thought was a little bit off. And we said, no, everything might be cloud or cloud oriented, but it's not all going to be running on someone else's servers. And so what we decided was we could sort of make enterprise software delivery much better for both the software vendors and the end customers by sort of leveraging these new technologies. And so that's always been the vision. Sort of we call it like modern on-prem or multi-prem, but the Replicated's customers are software vendors. So CircleCI was one of our very first customers, been with us for a long time. And then we've added other amazing customers like UiPath and Puppet and DataStax and many more who are all kind of doing the exact same thing with Replicated, taking their Kubernetes-based applications, could be Helm charts, could be operators, and then delivering that into customer environments and then making it easier to update, manage, support, and just generally take advantage of like the sort of third-party application delivery and management tools that we provide.
Yeah. I think one of the things that's really interesting about, I think it's a great observation because we've seen it, right? That people want, there's always someone who has a need to fulfill that involves running what are now becoming fairly complex software systems, because that's how we build software systems these days. They have a need to run that in their environment. I think one of the things that's really interesting to me about your evolution is in 2015, you had a bigger gap to fill, which was people don't really have an orchestration engine, right? Or like we can't just plug into a known orchestration engine, and that shifted over time. So tell me about that evolution a little bit.
Yeah, like every software company from 2010, 2015, we wrote our own orchestration and scheduling like sort of thing, and it's just what everybody did. It's like you had Fleet from CoreOS, you had everybody like Cloud Foundry had one, like Mesos, even all the like hyper clouds had internal ones, like Facebook had Tupperware and Uber had Peloton, and so we wrote our own and we exposed that to customers, and we made it proprietary. It was like a thing that we just shipped. We didn't even really think that we were making container orchestration. We just thought we were helping people like organize how their containers deployed, right? And then like turns out that that's what it is. And so it was really challenging to like sort of onboard software vendors into a new kind of like domain specific language around how to invoke the functionality of our scheduler. And so it became kind of a hassle to have what we kind of like call the Replicated native scheduler as the primary onboarding tool. And so we always knew that like, as these new orchestration tools, Docker Swarm and Kubernetes, really the two that we focused on, started to become more popular, that they needed to become the primary way that folks used Replicated. Right. But to your point, it really changed the value. And I still remember you gave this great talk, I think it was like 3-4 years ago at KubeCon, and you said, yeah, sure, we're using Replicated today to deliver our product to enterprise customers, but over time, we're just going to use Kubernetes and we're not going to use Replicated anymore. And I remember my co-founder, Mark, and I were watching that, and we were like, we knew you were right. We were like, he's not like, and so we were actually kind of excited. The funny thing is like, it's sort of this like bad news. Your customer might not use you anymore. But for us, it was like, no, he gets it. And this is the future. And so we'd been talking about this a lot and trying to figure out, well, what is the right solution for helping Kubernetes native applications deliver their Helm charts or operators, or whatever else, into customer environments. And it took us a couple tries, interestingly. Like we had a Kubernetes sort of like compatible solution that was very much like just based off of our original technology. Then we wrote this totally other kind of off the wall thing that was like a super heavy and customized. And then eventually we wound up with our Kubernetes off-the-shelf software project called COTS. And it's really been the thing that has found, I'd say, like really great customer pool and has solved a bunch of problems. But Kubernetes disrupted, our ecosystem, and it made us say like, hey, packaging is no longer the important part. Mm-hmm. The important part is the tooling around software delivery and management. Like packaging is sort of like a given. And now you're obviously going to package it as a Kubernetes application, but how are you going to then operationalize the delivery of that product into all these customer environments?
Right, and I think that, the thing that we always focus on in what we think about for our own product is helping people deliver more effectively, right? And I think that aligning especially for companies like us who are delivering something as a cloud offering and also packaging it or attempting to package it to deliver as a server offering, that alignment of how things get built and operated is super valuable, right? In terms of reducing the friction, right? So that saying, okay, well, now conveniently, Kubernetes is kind of one, like you just listed 20 orchestration engines that most people don't remember, and everyone just talks about Kubernetes. So that's great. It simplifies your role.
For sure.
And can say, okay, now everyone can focus on delivering their business logic and software and capabilities, not delivering their own orchestration engine, right? So everyone is freed from that a little bit. But how do we as Replicated enable that and allow them to deliver really effectively? One of the things that I think is really cool in there that also like allows you to deliver is acknowledging we've built a thing, but it's not our core business. Yeah. And we're going to jettison that thing because that allows us to move faster, right? And we can focus on our core value. And I think a lot of people get stuck in like, well, we built that thing.
Right.
And ours is 3% better than, or it's like tailored to our specific use case or whatever. Yep. But it's not even, in this case, not even how your customers are working. So that's not helpful. But the kind of, I think it's liberating to say, you know what, we built that thing and now we don't need it anymore. We're going to get rid of it. We also had a scheduler. Yeah. Right. Everybody had a scheduler at some point. And to then like focus down. So as a, I think you were definitely, and it's smaller then, and you're saying it was you and Mark having the conversation, but was that something that was sort of a hard conversation to have internally? Like, yep, we learned something from doing this, and now we're going to go another direction because we see where people are, where our customers are trying to go?
Yeah. It was scary, right? Like, we didn't really have total product market fit at the time, but I think we were over $1 million in ARR, right? So like we were doing okay. Like we were growing. We had customers that were using it. We had customers that loved it. And so you're saying, we knew that there was like an existential threat, and then we were like, we're not going to exist in 3 years if we don't make this change. Yeah. And like that is in itself, it's scary. And we did it wrong. Like the first 2 times that we tried to really make Kubernetes like the foundation. And it wasn't until we kind of went back to the drawing board and we went super Kubernetes native that we actually got to the right product. Yeah. But like, if that had been if we had missed then we wouldn't be having this conversation, right? Yeah. I'd be like somewhere else, working for some big bank maybe or something else, right? I wouldn't be running this company. So it's a gamble, and you have to. I was very lucky, and I put a lot of faith in my co-founder Mark. I was like, Mark, this problem. We need you to solve it. And so we worked with the team, and he kind of created the version that people know and love today. And we're still like, we still have a lot left to go, right? Still a lot left to do. I think we're in a market that's still like, I don't really even know how to describe it to the end user, right? Yeah. It's easy for me to talk to software vendors about it, but ultimately there's a ton of value for, the central IT or corporate IT when you think about this idea of consuming more applications that are easier to run in their own environment. So instead of sending data out to thousands of different vendors, they can start to bring the applications to where the data already resides. Yeah. Like, that's a really great value proposition, but like it's almost impossible to even describe it to someone at, a bank or a healthcare company or something else. Cause I'm like, do you run commercial third-party applications? Like, how do you manage them? And they're like, oh, basically every team manages them differently. And so it's a really kind of complex thing to talk about. And, and we still think there's a huge amount of market for us to tackle over the next, call it like, 5-10 years.
Yeah. Yeah. So you raise this point in there of, all these different teams running things differently, which I think is like, if you go back to what we're talking about with respect to Kubernetes, it's, people trying to get to a place where, we can do the same thing because that allows us to focus. And in these larger organizations, are you seeing a drive to return to sort of more consistency, or is sort of autonomy winning, like speed in the small that maybe is a trade-off for someone that's trying to manage the overall view of the system?
Yeah, I mean, I think the best thing about the Kubernetes, like, and I guess like about Kubernetes in general, is the ecosystem. And it's because there's enough sort of variety in the ecosystem and there's a consistency and pluggability, and you kind of like, can use a different ingress or something else, and it still kind of works in a similar way. That allows people to sort of optimize within sort of boundaries and to be a little bit like innovative and to try new things out and solve new problems without feeling like they are, moving everything completely in a different direction. And so I do think that there's a push towards sort of that consistency, right? And I talk about Kubernetes as these like primitives with like a bunch of patterns that we can all follow. And there's enough sort of variety within that it solves enough complex problems that you can stay within the ecosystem, within the primitives, within the patterns. And, you could hire someone else from, it's like tomorrow and onboard them into your Kubernetes environment. And like, they're probably going to get it right away versus like trying to teach them some like, bespoke orchestration tool that you wrote. And like, the person that wrote it's no longer there.
Right.
So that, those are the big benefits in my mind.
Yeah. Yeah. I think like, all of this, it's, What I've been trying to figure out as I'm observing these trends is we create these foundational layers, right? Like just like you said, I can bring someone in and say, look, we're using Kubernetes. They're like, yep, Kubernetes, I understand. Like I've worked on that before. Maybe they don't have 10 years, but they have a few years, right? and that gives them the ability to
10 years of Kubernetes experience in Kubernetes, experience world. That's like, 2 years of Kubernetes is really 10 years of experience. It is. It's how it is.
Kubernetes years?
Yeah.
That's right. Like I think, what would it be to get more than 4? You would have had to work at Google on something internally, right?
So exactly, yeah.
But, we create these abstraction layers, ideally, right? It's like, okay, we have people who understand Kubernetes and they can work on that, and I can just plug in on top. But I feel like our abstractions are still really leaky, right? So software engineers are trying to just build the thing that, does the product work.
Sure.
And they're like, awesome, but now to actually go run it, to put it in a production environment, I need to understand how Kubernetes works, how it's baked, et cetera. Like, do you think we're on a path, and maybe that's what everyone in this exhibit hall is trying to do, but are we on a path where we actually allow developers to get back out of that a little bit and focus on delivering product value?
Yeah, I mean, I think my perspective is it'll be kind of both, right? So there will always be engineers and folks that need to build something closer to the primitives, and then there will be folks who are able to like consume those services and build away from the primitives and maybe have an easier time. I do really think that like building a truly reliable, scalable application is much easier today than it was 20 years ago, right? Because of those primitives. And then to your point, over time, those primitives become much more sort of like almost unnoticed, right? They're there and you expect them to work. And this is sort of the value of like things getting boring is that, you're like, oh yeah, it works. And I expect it to work. And like, it's just how it is. And so, I think Kubernetes is getting a little more boring, which is great. But I think it's still going to be at the foundation of a lot of software and then the platforms that are built on top of it to make it easier for everyone else.
Right. I love that word, boring. It's like we just in a recent conversation we were talking a lot about being lazy, and so like these things are nobody sets out or strives to build boring technology or whatever, but it's actually, I think, compartmentalizing things, right? Like, okay, I can rely on that working.
Yeah.
And now I can go build something that's new and innovative, as opposed to, I start from figuring out orchestration or how my services talk to each other or whatever, instead of I'm working on the innovative thing. That's interesting, looking at it that way, to think about these cycles, right? That you're sort of just describing. Like, there's tech that started out being really hard to use, and then we got it dialed in a little bit, and then people had, abstractions over top of it, and then we're able to focus again. And then we go through these kind of rapid innovation cycles. And then I feel like we get bored with innovating on product. And then we're like, maybe we need a new infrastructure layer that we like change it all again, right? Like, I think early AWS even, or cloud infrastructure in general, probably was a bit of that. Like, I remember those early, like, how are we going to run a database in this environment was a hard thing. And then one day there was just RDS, and everyone's like, yeah, we'll just use RDS, and now we can stop thinking about our database kind of thing, right? So maybe this gets us there, or that's where we need to get, I guess, is what you're saying from a Kubernetes perspective, to be like, okay, That's all settled a little bit. We all know how we're using it.
Yeah.
And now we can all go. I mean, first it was the competition of the orchestration engines.
Yep.
Right. And then it was, oh, well, now we just need to get good at Kubernetes. And then maybe that settles and you're like, great, now we're back to sort of build, if we get into that product cycle again.
Yeah. And I think to your point, this is like the technology adoption life cycle, right?
Yeah.
You know, it's not anything new. And it's like, you know, of course we go back every few years, and I think, you know, constantly questioning what we have and making sure that we're, you know, on the best path is great. And that's like why I think this community continues to move things forward in such a way that you have to be constantly kind of on, you know, evaluating what's coming next and how can you be a part of it and what can you do to drive the industry forward. And that's a great thing about technology, because, you know, it's part of what is making every company become a software company. It's just like you have to create value for your customers with software. And, you know, I think I remember, like, this might be in some CircleCI marketing material or deck or something that I've seen, but like every company out there has to figure out how to do this, because if they don't, you see the disruption that happens, the creative destruction, where the next company comes through and solves that problem in a much more like efficient and effective way. And software is like, it's super value generating and it's super repeatable. And so, you know, we're just going to see this happen throughout, and companies can either decide to get on board and to make this a core sort of competency and, you know, be able to create, you know, value through customers with software, or for customers with software, or they can let their competitors take the market.
Right. I totally agree. I mean, I say those words all the time, right? Every experience is now a digital experience. The way that you interact with almost every service is through, you know, online, on your phone, whatever that might be. And the companies that are innovating and excelling at delivering customer value in that environment are the ones that are winning, right? And that's what's so interesting to me about all this kind of infrastructure churn is if you get sucked into that, then, you know, you can end up spending less time building the things that your customers really need. Like, it's weird for us to talk about it because we're so deep in the infrastructure space, but like most people building software, their customers don't care, don't even know if they're using Kubernetes or still building a Rails monolith on top of like an EC2 instance or whatever, right? So it's like, what am I delivering to my, and how can I optimize for getting that out as quickly as possible? And that's why this whole, you know, consolidation, consistency piece, I think is really interesting, giving people that, you know, like, look, here's the foundation. It's super easy. Everyone understands it. Now let's go build software on top of it. I want to go back to something that you said earlier, though, just about the transition, right? Like kind of making that bet, and then whether or not we'd be sitting here having, you know, the conversation. I think that one of the most interesting things about being around in a company for a long time is that you've seen those decisions play out. You can kind of look back and go, yep, I wish I could get that one back because that was pretty painful, but oh my, you know, I'm really glad we made this bet, and it was really scary at the time, but now I'm sitting here talking about it thinking that really worked out. Is there anything, you know, you talked about making a couple different turns, but is there anything you're looking back on now where you feel like you wish you had learned something faster, or maybe like you came out of it and you could say, well, we saw the signs earlier, but we weren't willing to accept it, like things that I think have built how you think about building now? Yeah,
I mean, you know, like there's definitely a lot around Kubernetes. Like I still remember being at DockerCon or KubeCon, and like Alex Polvey, who was the founder of CoreOS, coming down an escalator and just being like, have you made the full move to Kubernetes yet? And this is like maybe a year and a half before we had done that, right? And so it's like, you know, those are the sort of, you have to be decisive and you have to move quickly. You know, and so that's one great lesson. I think that open source, like we didn't open source a lot of our early technology, and now we've done that. It's made a big difference in terms of transparency and how people see us. You know, investments in security. Like we've always been a security focused company, but really investing in security to make sure that, you know, it's a value proposition, not just like a, you know, a checkbox. I think is a core lesson. And then, you know, just as like a company builder, we just didn't have many execs for a long time. Like there was basically no other execs at Replicated until, you know, 20 months ago. And really bringing in talented executives who like have done this before, it just took so much of the burden off of my shoulders, my co-founder's shoulders, and gave us the ability to like sleep at night, basically. Like not kidding. Like, you know, when you start a company and you're going through these challenges, like there's probably 2 years where I was like, you know, waking up for 2 hours every night with my mind racing about the company. And so now like, I know that I can trust really talented folks to actually like take care of, you know, some part of the business that I don't have to like worry about all the time.
Yeah. Wow, that's huge. I think that whole transition, which is very common in companies, right? As you go from small and start to grow from somebody needs to be a generalist sort of covering everything to, oh, now we have the space to bring in someone who's deeply experienced in this area and is just going to like launch us forward. And I think it's a really interesting one to reflect on because you end up saying, oh, I wish I'd done that earlier, but you weren't ready. You know, like, and finding that moment where like, okay, now we understand how we're executing and we can put someone on that specialty. Like otherwise you end up hiring someone with a specialty and then it turns out you don't need it, right?
Right, yeah.
What if you hired a bunch of specialists in orchestration engines in the early days? Then you're like, oh, wait a second, that's not even our product. So I guess we'll just let you all go, or you can learn this like totally other thing that we're going to go do, right? So I think it's a really fun moment to go through where you're like, oh, now I need someone to do this. And not only do I trust them, but they're way better at it than I ever was, right? Because I'm trying to do all these different things. It's a really cool transition to go through. But
it's hard for founders because it's hard to let go. And it's hard to trust, and it's hard to like really know. You're like, you've been living on the brink for so long. You're like, have we really done it? Should we really invest now? Yeah. And taking that step is big and it's hard.
Right. But then allows, everyone to come in and focus and really execute, right? Deliver against the thing that they know they own. And I think it's ideally an accelerant.
Yeah, for sure.
In that transition. And I think about it all the way down into software teams, right? When you go from, well, we just have a few engineers, they have to be able to do everything, to now we can start to pull this apart. Like we have people who are really good at this and people who are really good at that. And they work together and collaborate, but having some of that experience and skill really helps us deliver overall.
Yeah, it's so true. I mean, specialization over time is super valuable. I mean, the jack of all trades kind of folks in the beginning are really, really useful as you want to like pivot and adjust and like being ready to do that. But once you're ready, having folks that like, can buckle down and know their thing really well, super valuable. We'll wrap up, but Grant, thanks so much for joining. Always a pleasure to chat. Good to see you here in person. Thanks to everybody who's listening. Subscribe and your favorite podcast provider. And if you want us to talk to anyone else or talk about anything else, hit us up on Twitter at CircleCI. Thanks again, Grant. Thanks again.